The moment arrives at 7:47 on a Saturday evening, November 15th, 1933, in the second-floor powder room of the Petroleum Club in downtown Houston. Two women standing before identical mirrors are about to accidentally dismantle 5 years of meticulously constructed deception with a single observation about jewelry. Margaret Hutchinson, widow of an oil broker, adjusts her pearl necklace. Catherine Embry, wife of a banker, reaches for her lipstick. They have never met. They have no reason to acknowledge each other beyond the polite nod of women occupying the same confined space. But Margaret glances at Catherine's wrist, at a bracelet of intricate gold filigree with 3 small rubies, set precisely at mathematical intervals, and something in her memory shifts violently. She has seen that bracelet before, not on Catherine's wrist, on the wrist of a woman she once called her dearest friend, her confidant, the person she had trusted above all others. "That's a beautiful piece," Margaret says, her voice careful, the words chosen deliberately. Catherine smiles, the reflexive smile of someone accustomed to compliments about inherited jewelry. "A gift from someone very dear to me. She said it was a family heirloom from her mother's estate in Charleston. Said her mother had worn it for 40 years before that." The powder room becomes very quiet. The ambient sounds of the party below, distant laughter, the orchestra, the clink of glasses, suddenly seem impossibly far away. Margaret's hand trembles slightly as she removes her own bracelet from her wrist, identical down to the smallest detail, down to the microscopic scratch on the back clasp. She holds it toward the light, watching how the rubies catch the glow from the vanity bulbs. "She told me the exact same thing," Margaret says, "except she said her mother's estate was in Savannah. She said her mother was named Elizabeth, and that she had been a widow for 30 years, and that the rubies came from a piece of jewelry her husband had bought her on their wedding day in 1882. Catherine's face changes. The smile doesn't disappear immediately. It simply becomes a different kind of expression, one that might be confusion, might be anger, might be something more complex that has no name. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," Catherine says. "I'm not suggesting anything," Margaret replies. "I'm telling you what I know. I'm telling you that I had a friend named Eleanor, and Eleanor gave me this bracelet and told me it was a family heirloom from Savannah, and I believed her. I believed everything she told me. What begins in that powder room is not the exposure of a criminal enterprise. What begins in that powder room is the systematic unraveling of something far more intricate, far more psychologically complex than a simple theft or a straightforward con. It is the exposure of a woman who did not merely lie about her name, her past, her identity. She had constructed, with almost surgical precision, 12 entirely separate and complete lives, 12 different names, 12 different backstories, 12 different versions of herself. Each one is real to the people who knew her as her own body was real to her. 12 women and men who believed they knew her intimately, who trusted her with their deepest vulnerabilities, who had allowed her into the sacred spaces of their hearts and their finances. By midnight that evening, whispers would travel through Houston society circles like contagion, spreading from one dining room to another, from one telephone call to another. By the end of the week, the newspapers would demand explanations and publish her photograph, though no one could quite agree on what she actually looked like. By month's end, she would disappear from Texas entirely, leaving behind not just financial devastation, but something far more damaging: the systematic destruction of 12 people's faith in their own ability to perceive reality, to judge character, to recognize deception in the face of someone they believed they knew. But the question that lingers, the one that Houston would never fully answer, is not how she did it. The techniques could be studied, the mechanisms could be understood, the methods could be documented. The question that truly haunts is why. Why does someone construct 12 distinct identities? What void inside a person is so profound that it requires 12 separate relationships to fill it? What kind of childhood, what kind of fundamental wound, creates a human being who understands identity itself as a costume that can be changed at will? The woman who was 12 had many answers to these questions. None of them were true. All of them made perfect sense. To understand the woman who was 12, you must first understand the girl who was none. You must understand what happens when a child learns, early and thoroughly, that being yourself is not enough, that the world does not reward authenticity, that invisibility is sometimes safer than presence. She was born in 1897 in Mobile, Alabama, to a mother whose name appears in historical records inconsistently. sometimes listed as Elizabeth, sometimes as Eliza Jane, sometimes absent entirely from official documentation. Her father was a riverboat captain named Thomas Caldwell, a man whose photograph survives in the Mobile Historical Archives, a stern-faced man with eyes that seemed to look past the camera rather than at it. He disappeared when she was 4 years old. The official story, repeated by neighbors and family friends, was that he had drowned in the Mobile River during a severe fog while returning from a shipment run. No body was recovered. The assumption among the polite society of Mobile was that the river had taken him completely, leaving no remains to bury. No one asked the girl if she had questions about where her father had gone. No one offered explanation beyond the simple fact of his absence. Her childhood was a peculiar kind of invisibility. She lived in her mother's house, a boarding house near the docks that catered to transient workers, merchants, and men, whose reasons for temporary residence in Mobile were never discussed in polite company. Her mother was a woman of remarkable efficiency, a person who ran her household with the precision of someone managing inventory rather than raising a child. The girl was not mistreated in any obvious way. She was not beaten. She was not deprived of food or shelter. She received an adequate education, attended school regularly, and was clothed appropriately for her station. She was not subjected to the kind of dramatic abuse that generates obvious psychological scarring. Instead, she was simply not seen. She existed in her mother's house the way furniture exists, acknowledged, maintained, but not engaged with. Her mother spoke to her primarily when necessary. Your room needs tidying. The kitchen needs sweeping. Guests will arrive at 4. You will stay in the back room. The girl became expert at making herself smaller, quieter, less present. She learned to read her mother's moods from the tightness of her jaw. She learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed. She learned that her value to her mother was instrumental. She was useful when she was needed, invisible when she was not. School provided temporary relief from this erasure. In the classroom, she could occupy defined roles. She was the quiet girl. She was the smart one. She was reliable. She was something. But weekends returned her to the boarding house where guests came and went with the tide of commerce and circumstance, and her mother spoke to her only when necessary, and she returned to the profound work of being invisible. At 14 years old, she made a discovery that would shape everything that followed. In her mother's bedroom, hidden beneath loose floorboards near the bed, she found a collection of letters. They were not from her father. They were from men, dozens of them, written across a span of years in different handwriting, on different paper. Some were tender and careful. Some were passionate and explicit. Some were cruel and demeaning. But in every single letter, written to the woman she called mother, her mother was someone entirely different. To one man, she was, "My darling Elizabeth, your devoted companion, the only woman who has ever truly understood my heart." To another, she was, "My spirited Eliza, wild and untamed, the one woman who makes me feel alive." To a third, she was, "My steady, reliable Beth, my anchor in the storm, the woman I can trust above all others." To a fourth, she was, "My mysterious love, you reveal yourself slowly and each revelation brings me deeper under your spell." She was tender. She was passionate. She was understanding. She was mysterious. She was competent. She was fragile. She was everything different men needed her to be. The girl understood in that moment of finding those letters, something that most people never fully comprehend in their entire lives. She understood that her mother had discovered a fundamental truth about human existence. Her mother had learned that you could be anyone, that identity was not fixed, that the world did not require you to be a single, consistent thing across time, that a name was merely a costume, and if you wore it with enough conviction, if you inhabited it with sufficient psychological authenticity, people would believe you were the person you claimed to be. More than that, they would love you for being that person. They would trust you. They would want you. They would, in the most profound sense, need you to exist. Her mother died in 1912, when the girl was 15 years old. The official cause listed by the doctor was pneumonia complicated by influenza. Neighbors whispered about drinking and the complications of a life lived in fragments, of a woman who had fractured herself so completely that her body simply could not maintain cohesion. The girl did not mourn in any conventional sense. She did not weep. She did not attend the funeral with visible grief. She did something far more purposeful. She packed a small bag containing only essential items, told no one of her intentions, and boarded a train heading west toward Texas. By 1918, at the age of 21, she had arrived in Houston. She had no money of significance. She had no connections to speak of. She had no identity that anyone could verify through official channels. But she had inherited from her mother something more valuable than wealth or connections. She understood that the only thing required to be someone is the absolute, unwavering certainty that you are that person. She had watched her mother create selves the way other people changed clothes. She had read her mother's love letters and understood that her mother was genuinely beloved, not despite her multiplicity, but because of it. Each man loved the version of her mother that she had become for him. Her mother had solved the fundamental problem of human loneliness. She had discovered how to be known, and the girl had decided that she would become a master of that craft. Her first years in Houston were experimental and exploratory. She worked as a boarding house keeper, then as a store clerk, then as a seamstress in a garment factory. In each position, she was genuinely someone different. Not through elaborate deception or conscious performance, but through authentic psychological transformation. When she worked for a wealthy family as a lady's companion, she became genteel and educated and spiritually contemplative. When she worked in a factory, she became sturdy and practical and unflinchingly hardworking. When she worked as a clerk in a shop, she became warm and engaging and interested in other people's lives. She was not pretending to be these people. She was becoming them. She was inhabiting each role with such complete authenticity that the people who knew her in each position believed they knew her entirely. She was not lying. She was genuinely becoming each time the person her circumstances required her to be. But becoming different people in different contexts was not the same as being known. And being known, being truly seen by another human being, being so thoroughly understood that someone would trust you with their vulnerability and their secrets, that was what she had learned from her mother's hidden letters was the most precious thing in the world. That was the thing her mother had possessed. That was the thing that made her mother alive, even in her fragmentation. So in 1922, at the age of 25, she began the work that would define her life and shape the lives of everyone who encountered her. She would stop rotating identities randomly through different contexts. She would stop becoming different people for different employers. Instead, she would create identities that could be inhabited completely, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally. She would build lives so believable that the people who entered them would never suspect they were entering a construction. She would be known so completely, so authentically, that the people who knew her would never doubt that they knew her at all. She would give each person exactly what they were desperate for, the experience of being truly understood. The first identity was Vivienne. The 12 names are only the public record. The 12 names are what appeared in newspaper articles, police reports, and legal documents after the unraveling. But the construction of a single identity, a complete life with depth and texture and psychological coherence, required far more than a name. It required backstory, documentation, psychological depth, financial justification, and an absolute understanding of what each particular person needed to believe about themselves in order to feel less alone. Vivienne was the beginning, the test case, the prototype for everything that followed. Vivienne was a widow, or so the carefully constructed story went. Her husband, a merchant from Charleston, had died of influenza in 1920, leaving her with a modest inheritance, some jewelry, and the kind of permanent sorrow that appeals to people who believe themselves sophisticated enough to appreciate sadness. She was educated, cultured, and slightly melancholic in a way that made people believe they were doing something noble by befriending her. She had no children. She had a small apartment that was neat and carefully appointed. She attended church regularly. She volunteered with charitable organizations. She was the kind of person that society values precisely because she is not demanding. She asks for nothing. She takes little space, and her presence somehow makes other people feel more generous, more good. Vivienne appeared at the Presbyterian Church in central Houston on a Sunday morning in March 1922. She sat in a pew near the back, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful and composed. She did not sing loudly during the hymns. She did not approach anyone after the service. She simply sat and listened and seemed to carry some private sorrow that was too delicate to burden others with. The minister's wife noticed her immediately. New people were always noticed in church, especially women alone. Within 2 weeks, Vivienne had been invited to 3 ladies' luncheons, 2 charitable committee meetings, and a private tea with Mrs. Hartwell, the wife of one of Houston's most prominent oil executives. The construction of Vivienne required 2 months of preparation before that Sunday in March. The woman who became Vivienne spent 8 weeks researching Charleston's architecture, its social register, its merchant families, its history going back to the colonial period. She memorized details about the influenza outbreak of 1920, the exact mortality rates in Charleston, the symptoms, the duration of illness, the way hospitals had been overwhelmed. She created complete documentation packages, marriage certificate, death certificate, banking records, using techniques she had learned from a forger in Galveston, who did not ask questions about the purposes his documents would serve. The documents were good, not perfect, good enough that no one thought to question them. No one ran verification. No one sent letters to Charleston requesting confirmation. The institutions of 1922 moved slowly, and verification across state lines took weeks, and by the time anyone might have thought to verify, Vivienne was already woven into the fabric of Houston society. But documents were not what made Vivienne believable. Documents could be forged, and forgeries could be discovered. What made Vivienne real was the absolute psychological authenticity of her grief. She would speak about her husband Thomas with the exact calibration of loss that people expected from a widow in her 3rd year of mourning. Grief had softened around the edges, but had not disappeared. She could speak of their years together with genuine tenderness, the way he had always brought her flowers on Friday evenings, the way he had laughed at her jokes, the way they had taken walks through the botanical gardens on Sunday afternoons. She could speak of his final illness with controlled sorrow. She remembered the exact progression of his symptoms, the way his fever had climbed despite the doctor's interventions, the sound of his breathing as it became more and more labored. When asked about her future, she would say with resigned grace and without self-pity that she had found peace in service to her community and in the companionship of good women. She had no desire to remarry. She had had her one great love, and that was enough. The world did not need her to find happiness again. She could be satisfied with the knowledge that she had been loved, had loved in return, and that nothing could take that away. What made this believable was not the story itself. There were dozens of widows in Houston in 1922 with similar stories. What made Vivienne believable was the person telling the story. Vivienne did not perform sorrow. She inhabited it. The woman who became Vivienne had spent weeks before the church appearance living inside Vivienne's emotional reality. She had asked herself the most profound psychological question: what would it feel like to lose the only person who had ever loved you unconditionally? How would you carry that knowledge forward through the rest of your life? What would you need from other people to survive that loss? She had answered those questions with such thorough precision, with such absolute psychological depth, that when she spoke about Thomas, her eyes actually glistened with tears. When she described the specific moment when she realized he was not going to survive, when she described sitting by his bed and understanding that he was slipping away from her, her voice actually wavered with genuine emotion. She was not pretending to feel these emotions. She was genuinely feeling them because she had made herself, through absolute conviction and psychological inhabitation, into Vivienne. Vivienne's grief was real. Vivienne's loneliness was real. Vivienne's desire to be part of a community was real. The people who knew Vivienne loved her. They were drawn to her like light to color. She was exactly what they needed, a woman who was broken enough to be interesting and worthy of their care, strong enough to be admirable, and lonely enough to appreciate their kindness with genuine gratitude. She never asked for anything. She only received what was offered, and she received it with such warmth and genuine thanks that people felt good about themselves when they were around her. Within 6 months of that first Sunday, Vivienne had become indispensable to Mrs. Hartwell. Within a year, she had become intimate with 4 different households, each one believing that she was their confidant, their friend, perhaps something like a sister. They trusted her with their secrets. They invited her to family dinners. They introduced her to their children. They wove her into the fabric of their lives so thoroughly that by the time she disappeared, they would struggle to remember what their lives had been like before she entered them. But even as Vivienne was being beloved, even as she was being integrated into these 4 households, the woman who inhabited Vivienne was already planning the next identity. She had learned something in becoming Vivienne that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was possible to be known completely. It was possible to have someone believe in you so thoroughly that they would trust you with their deepest secrets, their vulnerabilities, their money, their children's futures. And once you understood that, once you had tasted what it felt like to be believed in so completely, you could not stop. The experience was addictive in the most profound sense. It was not the money. It was not the status. It was the experience of being seen, being known, being needed by another human being. The question that would eventually haunt Houston was not how these identities were maintained. That question could be answered through analysis of techniques and psychological mechanisms. The question was, why did she need so many? Why could not Vivienne, who had been given everything, love, trust, security, genuine human connection, be enough? Why did she need to be 12 different people? What kind of hunger was so profound that no single relationship could satisfy it? The answer begins to emerge when you understand that each identity was not additive. Each identity was a complete replacement of the previous one. She did not keep Vivienne alive while also becoming Catherine. She became Catherine entirely, and Vivienne was archived, stored away, made dormant in her consciousness. But the part of herself that had become Vivienne, the part that had experienced being loved, being known, being seen as indispensable, that part remained alive in her consciousness. That part remembered what it felt like. That part wanted to feel that way again. And that part was insatiable. It wanted to feel that way over and over and over again. She needed to be Vivienne again, and again, and again. But she could not be Vivienne, because Vivienne's circle was closed. Vivienne had friends who had become like sisters. Vivienne had a place in 4 households that was defined and unchangeable. Vivienne could not simply leave and return without explanation. Vivienne was locked into a narrative that had its own momentum, its own expectations, its own future. So she became someone else. She became Catherine. She became Eleanor. She became Margaret. She became 9 more names, each one a complete person, each one genuinely loved, each one eventually abandoned for the next chance to be known, to be seen, to be believed in completely. Did she understand what she was doing? This question separates monster from tragedy. Did she understand that each person she constructed a life with would experience abandonment, deception, loss? Or did she genuinely believe each time she began a new identity, that this identity, this particular name, this particular life, would be the one that satisfied her? Did she think as she began each new life that she had finally found the place where she could stop running? Did she believe that this person, with their particular vulnerabilities and needs, would finally be enough? The answer is both, and neither. She understood and did not understand. She knew and did not know. And that is what makes her neither villain nor victim, but something far more human and far more tragic. Someone caught between the desperate desire to be known and the absolute terror of staying still long enough to be truly seen. The second identity was Catherine, and Catherine was everything Vivienne was not. Where Vivienne had been melancholic and spiritually contemplative, moving through the world with the quiet resignation of someone who had already experienced the worst that life could offer, Catherine was vibrant and intellectually curious. Where Vivienne had sought comfort in committees and church gatherings and the company of other women, Catherine sought excitement in the company of younger people, in the exploration of new ideas, in the intoxicating possibility of romantic love. Catherine was not a widow. Catherine was a woman who had never married, not because no one had wanted her but by choice. A woman who had always been independent, who valued her freedom, who had traveled extensively, and who was at last, at this particular moment in her life, beginning to consider sharing that life with the right person. Catherine appeared in Houston's society in late 1924, arriving as a guest of a visiting oil family from Dallas. She was introduced to James Embry, the son of one of Houston's founding banking families, at a private dinner given by mutual friends. James was 31 years old, unmarried, and trapped in the kind of golden cage that old money creates. He had been expected to marry since his teenage years. Several women had been proposed to him by his family, women from appropriate families, women with sufficient breeding and wealth. He had refused them all, claiming with increasing frustration that he had not yet met the woman who could make him forget his own solitude, who could match his intellectual curiosity, who could be his equal rather than his ornament. Catherine was that woman. She was not the most beautiful woman James had ever encountered. She was not the richest. She was not connected by birth to the most powerful family in Texas, but she was to James the only woman who had ever made him feel truly understood. Catherine would sit with him in the library of his family's house and discuss Dostoevsky, with an intelligence that matched his own. She would argue with him about philosophy, challenging his assumptions, making him think more deeply than he had been forced to think in years. She would laugh at his jokes in a way that suggested she was laughing with him, not at him. When he spoke about his father's expectations, about the weight of the family name, about the impossible standard that his position in society created, she did not dismiss them or belittle them or try to make him feel better through false reassurance. She acknowledged the weight of those expectations with genuine understanding. She acknowledged that they were real and formidable. And then she said something that changed how James understood his own life. Perhaps what your father wanted for you was not what you needed for yourself. Perhaps the greatest act of courage is becoming exactly who you are, without apology, and accepting that your father might never understand why that matters. James fell in love with her. The remarkable thing about this deception is that Catherine genuinely was everything she claimed to be in terms of her intellectual and emotional capacity. Catherine genuinely did find Dostoevsky interesting. Catherine genuinely had thoughts about philosophy that were original and worth considering. Catherine genuinely was capable of the kind of intellectual companionship that James had been missing. The woman who became Catherine was intelligent, educated, and thoughtful. She had prepared for this identity by spending weeks reading Dostoevsky, by studying philosophy, by training herself to think in the analytical patterns that would appeal to a man like James. But the performance of intellectual interest was not required, because the interest was genuine. She actually was the kind of person who thought deeply about ideas. She actually was the kind of person who could understand James's alienation from his family's expectations. She actually was the kind of person worthy of his respect. This is what made Catherine more dangerous than Vivienne. Vivienne had been constructed almost entirely from fabrication. The widow story, the dead husband, the modest inheritance, the spiritual wisdom that came from loss. But most of what Catherine was telling James was true. Her thoughts were her actual thoughts. Her interests were her actual interests. Her capacity for understanding was not performed, it was the genuine exercise of her actual intelligence. She had become Catherine, and Catherine's thoughts were her thoughts because she had inhabited Catherine so completely. When she told James that she loved him, was she lying? This is the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Did she love him? Or did she love what loving him allowed her to become? Did her emotions for him originate in genuine connection? Or were they the byproduct of her complete inhabitation of Catherine's role? In the moment that she said, "I love you, James," did she believe it? The answer is almost certainly yes. In that moment, she was Catherine. Catherine's love was real. Catherine's desire to build a life with him was real. But Catherine was not her. Catherine was a construction. And when the time came to move on, when the hunger to be someone else, to be known by someone new, became stronger than the love she felt for James, Catherine's emotions ended completely. The psychological reality of Catherine's feelings simply disappeared, replaced by the emotional reality of the next identity, the next person, the next complete inhabitation of a different life. The mechanics of maintaining multiple identities required extraordinary discipline and psychological sophistication. She kept a journal hidden in a locked box in her rented room, a journal that was never shown to anyone, in which she recorded details about each person's life. She wrote down what they had told her about themselves, their fears, their desires, their family histories. She wrote down conversations so that she could remember them exactly, could return to them with authentic recall, could demonstrate the kind of total attention that makes someone feel truly seen. She maintained separate wardrobes for each identity, kept in separate rooms, in separate boarding houses that she rented under different names. She developed different handwriting styles for different identities, different speech patterns, different ways of moving through the world. Vivienne moved slowly with careful consideration. Catherine moved quickly, with energy and engagement. But the most crucial mechanism for maintaining multiple identities was psychological compartmentalization, so complete that it bordered on actual dissociation, a fragmentation of consciousness that psychologists of that era did not yet have the language to fully understand. When she was Vivienne, she was not thinking about Catherine. Catherine did not exist in her consciousness. There was no part of her mind that was divided, that was holding back, that was remembering her other lives and preparing for the next transition. She was Vivienne completely. She was Vivienne so completely that her body chemistry changed, her nervous system calmed, her speech patterns shifted. When she became Catherine, she was Catherine completely. The transition between identities was not a removal of a mask. It was a fundamental shift in consciousness, as if the previous identity had been a dream she had awakened from, and the dream could not be remembered with perfect clarity anymore. Only its general emotional tone remained. This kind of psychological flexibility, or psychological fragmentation depending on one's perspective, is not common in the general population. It suggests something essential about her neurology, her psychology, her capacity for dissociation. It suggests that whatever it was that had been broken in her childhood, whatever wound had been created by her absent father and her emotionally unavailable mother, had fundamentally altered her sense of self. She did not have a fixed identity to return to. She did not have a core self that remained consistent across all of her lives. She was only selves. She was only the person she was constructing in any given moment. When that construction was deconstructed, when she moved on to the next identity, she was a blank slate again, ready to be filled with a new person entirely. The question of whether this made her psychologically ill, mentally disordered, or simply extraordinarily gifted at the art of psychological transformation is one that psychology has never adequately answered. Were her multiple identities a form of dissociative identity disorder, a fragmentation of self caused by trauma, or were they the calculated construction of someone with extraordinary emotional intelligence, perfect control over her own psychology, and the ability to will herself into different states of consciousness through sheer determination and practice? The answer is that they were both, and neither. She was neither sick nor well. She was not operating from pathology. She was not operating from perfect health. She was operating from a particular kind of human capacity, the capacity to become completely and utterly someone else, the capacity to invest so completely in a false identity that the identity became true, the capacity to love someone while pretending to be someone you were not, the capacity to deceive people so thoroughly that they never suspected they had been deceived, right up until the moment of exposure. And James Embry, in the fall of 1924, was completely unprepared for what it would feel like to love someone with that capacity. The most dangerous thing that Catherine could have done, the thing that would eventually contribute to her downfall, was to let James believe that he truly understood her. She did this not through revelation of truth, but through the careful construction of vulnerability. She told him stories about her childhood that were partially true. Her father had been absent. Her mother had been emotionally distant. She had grown up feeling unseen and misunderstood by the people closest to her. These things were true. They were the actual experiences of the woman who was becoming Catherine. But she never mentioned the specific horror of those years, the degree of invisibility she had endured, the boarding house filled with strangers, the mother who had loved other men's letters more than her daughter. Instead, she presented a version of that pain that was relatable, that was recognizable to James, that made him feel that his own struggles with his family were not unique or peculiar, but part of a shared human experience. She created a mythology of herself that was irresistible to him. She was a woman who had suffered but had not been broken. She was a woman who had chosen independence and freedom. She was a woman who had traveled widely. She had been to Europe, she had studied in London. She had lived in New York for 2 years while studying art history. All of these things were either true or partially true. She had been to Europe. She had spent time in multiple cities. But the timeline was flexible. The details were adjusted. The stories were shaped to fit the person she was becoming for James. She would recount an anecdote about sitting in a cafe in Paris and realizing that she was completely alone, that she had no one who knew her name, that she was invisible even to herself. And James would hold her hand and tell her that he knew her, that he saw her, that he would never let her feel that way again. This was the moment when she became addicted to him, or appeared to become addicted to him, or actually did become addicted to him in the moment, even though the addiction would disappear as completely as Catherine herself would eventually disappear. She would say to him with genuine emotional intensity, "You make me feel like I exist. Before I met you, I was moving through the world like a ghost. And now, because you see me, I'm real." And James believed this completely. He believed that he had saved her. He believed that his love had brought her into actual existence. He believed that without him, she would disappear back into the invisible spaces she had inhabited before. The power of this dynamic is that it created a reciprocal need. James needed to believe that Catherine needed him. Catherine, for her part, performed needing him with such perfection that the performance became true. She relied on him. She trusted him with her vulnerability. She called him when she was frightened or sad or confused. She made his comfort necessary to her functioning, and in doing so, she tied him to her with bonds that were stronger than love, stronger than desire, stronger than any rational assessment of what would be good for him. 4 months into their relationship, James proposed. He had a ring made, a platinum band with a diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. He presented it to her one evening in the library where they had first met, where they had first discussed Dostoevsky, where they had first understood that they might be capable of understanding each other. She said yes. She said it with tears in her eyes. She said it while thinking about whether she would stay with him or whether this was the moment when she had gotten what she needed from him, and it was time to move on. The engagement lasted for 6 months. During those 6 months, Catherine slowly began to withdraw emotionally, not dramatically, not in a way that James could clearly identify as withdrawal, but small distances began to appear. She became slightly less responsive to his touch. She developed headaches that prevented them from being intimate. She began to express doubt about her capacity to be a good wife. She said things like, "Maybe I'm too independent. Maybe I don't know how to be married. Maybe I'm not the person you think I am." And each time she said these things, James would reassure her. He would tell her that she was exactly the person he thought she was. He would tell her that she was perfect. He would tell her that his love was enough for both of them. What James did not understand was that Catherine was telling him the truth. She was not the person he thought she was. She was not the woman he had fallen in love with. She was someone else entirely. She was someone who was beginning to suffocate under the weight of being known, of being loved, of being seen. She was someone who was already thinking about the next identity, the next person, the next chance to be brand new to someone. In December 1924, 3 weeks before their wedding was scheduled to take place, Catherine disappeared. She left a letter that James found when he came to her apartment expecting to spend the evening with her. The letter was brief. It said that she had realized she was not ready to be married. It said that she loved him, but that love was not enough. It said that she was leaving Houston and would not be returning. It signed off with her name, Catherine, as if she had been named that by her own choice, as if Catherine was the thing she fundamentally was. What James did not understand, what he would not understand for months afterward, was that Catherine had never been real. James did not understand what it meant to love someone who was not anyone. He spent the next 6 months trying to understand what he had done wrong, what he had missed, what signal he had failed to perceive. He wrote letters to Catherine at her former address. He hired a private investigator to find her. He asked himself again and again the question that would define the rest of his life. How did I love someone I did not know? The answer was simple and devastating. He loved her because she had been exactly who he needed her to be. She had inhabited his deepest desire, to be understood, to be seen, to be known, with such perfection that he had believed it. He had believed her completely, and when she left, when he discovered that she had never been real, that she had been a construction built specifically to appeal to him, the pain was not just the pain of losing someone he loved. It was the pain of discovering that his ability to judge character, his ability to perceive truth, his ability to know another person, was fundamentally compromised. Have you ever realized someone wasn't who you thought they were? Have you ever looked back at moments that meant everything to you and realized that you were being manipulated in those moments? The victims of this woman asked themselves these questions again and again, and they could never arrive at a satisfactory answer. By 1926, she had refined her methods. Catherine's disappearance had taught her something important. The longer she stayed with someone, the more likely they were to discover inconsistencies, to ask questions that required detailed answers, to eventually realize that she was not who she claimed to be. So she began to compress the timeline. She would move faster into intimacy. She would establish her emotional dominance more quickly. She would create dependency earlier in the relationship. And then she would disappear before the structures she had built could become unstable. Eleanor was different because Eleanor was designed for a specific kind of person. Eleanor appeared in Houston society in the spring of 1926, introduced by friends of the Hartwell family, people who remembered Vivienne, though Vivienne had been gone for nearly 3 years. Eleanor was positioned as a distant relation of Vivienne, someone who had also lost her husband, someone who was also learning to navigate the world as a widow. She was given immediate credibility through Vivienne's phantom reputation. Within weeks, she had been invited into the home of Margaret Hutchinson, a widow herself, a woman who had been widowed for 10 years, and who had long since given up any hope of romantic connection or excitement. The construction of Eleanor required understanding what Margaret wanted more than anything else. She wanted to feel alive again. She wanted adventure. She wanted to feel desired. She wanted to believe that age and loss had not made her irrelevant. Eleanor provided all of these things. Eleanor was not young, but she was younger than Margaret. Eleanor was vivacious and energetic. Eleanor had stories about traveling in Europe, about attending salons where ideas were discussed, about living a life that was interesting and full. Eleanor looked at Margaret as if Margaret was the most fascinating person she had ever met. Eleanor said things like, "You have such depth. Women like us. Women who have lived, who have suffered, who have understood loss. We have something that younger women don't have. We have experience. We have wisdom. We have something precious to offer the world." Within 2 months, Eleanor and Margaret were inseparable. Margaret had given Eleanor a key to her house. Eleanor would arrive early in the morning and they would have breakfast together. They would attend concerts together. They would travel to Galveston for a weekend and stay in a hotel and pretend they were younger women on an adventure. Eleanor told Margaret things that she claimed she had never told anyone. She told Margaret about a man in Europe who had wanted to marry her, but whom she had not married because she did not believe in romantic love. She told Margaret about a painting she had seen in Paris that had moved her so deeply that she had wept. She told Margaret things that were partially true and partially fabricated, and Margaret believed all of it because Eleanor told it with such conviction. More importantly, Eleanor made Margaret feel seen. Eleanor asked Margaret about her life before marriage. Eleanor wanted to know about the dreams Margaret had had as a young woman, the dreams that had been set aside when she married, the dreams that she had been too obedient to pursue. Eleanor would sit with Margaret in the evening, and they would talk about the ways that society had constrained them, the ways that their choices had been made for them by others' expectations, the ways that they had been required to be someone other than who they actually were. And through these conversations, Eleanor helped Margaret grieve something she had never actually grieved before, the life she might have lived if she had been brave. This created a bond that was almost intimate in nature, though not romantic. It was the kind of intimacy that emerges between women who believe they understand each other's specific form of invisibility. Margaret had money. She had inherited substantial wealth from her husband. Eleanor gradually began to explain to Margaret that she had made some poor investments, that she was in financial difficulty, that she had no family who could help her. Margaret, without being asked directly, offered to help. Margaret said things like, "You have given me back my life. You have made me feel like I matter. Please let me give you this." The money was never repaid. By the time Margaret realized this, Eleanor had disappeared, leaving only a brief note expressing regret and gratitude. Margaret did not report the theft. She did not contact the police. Like James Embry, Margaret found herself unable to articulate what had happened to her. What crime had been committed? Eleanor had not threatened her. Eleanor had not stolen anything from her. Margaret had given Eleanor the money willingly. The crime was something more subtle and more devastating. Eleanor had stolen Margaret's belief in her own judgment. Eleanor had stolen her sense of self-worth. Eleanor had made Margaret feel alive, and then she had taken that feeling away. But Eleanor was not alone in this capacity. Between 1926 and 1932, there were 9 more identities. There was Sarah, who attached herself to the wife of a prominent judge and slowly extracted both money and jewels through a series of small requests, each one justified, each one urgent, each one seemingly temporary. Sarah was gone within 18 months, leaving behind not just financial loss but psychological devastation. The judge's wife had trusted Sarah completely, and when Sarah disappeared, she found herself unable to trust anyone again. There was Miriam, who became the intimate companion of a wealthy widow named Patricia, who had lost her husband in the 1920s and who had no children. Miriam positioned herself as the daughter Patricia had never had. Miriam spent 3 years in Patricia's house. Miriam attended all of Patricia's social events. Miriam was listed in Patricia's will as the primary beneficiary. Miriam was loved so completely that Patricia actually did, in the end, change her will to leave her entire estate to Miriam. And then, the day after Patricia died, Miriam claimed the inheritance and disappeared. Patricia's actual relatives did not contest the will, though they suspected fraud. They had no proof. They had only the knowledge that their mother had loved Miriam more than she had loved them, and they had to live with that knowledge. There was Henry's wife, though we know her as Margaret in this context, A woman who met Eleanor at a social event and found that Eleanor was exactly what she needed. Someone who understood her husband's emotional distance. Someone who validated her loneliness. Someone who seemed to care more about her well-being than her own husband did. Over the course of 2 years, Eleanor convinced Margaret that she was in love with a man who did not deserve her, that she had wasted the best years of her life on someone who did not appreciate her, that she deserved to run away and start over. Eleanor helped Margaret plan to leave her husband. Eleanor helped Margaret liquidate some of her assets, and then Eleanor disappeared with the money, leaving Margaret stranded in a hotel room in New Orleans with no money, no husband, and no way home. Each identity followed the same basic structure: identification of a vulnerable person, rapid building of intimacy, identification of what that person needed most, provision of that need with such perfection that the person became addicted to the relationship, and then disappearance. But within this structure there was significant variation. She learned from each identity about how to make the next one more effective. She learned which kinds of vulnerability were easiest to exploit. She learned which kinds of lies were most easily believed. She learned what made people overlook inconsistencies, what made people ignore red flags, what made people become so psychologically dependent on another person that they lost their ability to perceive reality accurately. She learned that the key to successful deception is not the convincingness of the lie. The key to successful deception is the vulnerability of the person being lied to. If you tell someone exactly what they want to believe, if you provide them with exactly what they most desperately need, they will work harder to believe you than you could ever work to deceive them. They will ignore contradictions. They will dismiss red flags. They will rationalize away inconsistencies. They will choose belief over doubt, because the emotional reward of being understood is more valuable to them than the safety of skepticism. By 1932, she had lived more lives than most people live in a single lifetime. She had been loved and trusted by 12 separate people. She had taken money from them. She had taken jewels from them. She had taken time from them. But most importantly, she had taken something far more precious from them. She had taken their faith in their own ability to recognize truth, and none of them suspected what was coming. None of them understood that they were part of a pattern, that there were 11 others like them, that all of them had been loved and abandoned in exactly the same way. They were isolated in their shame. They were alone in their conviction that they had failed somehow, that they had missed something, that their judgment was fundamentally flawed. What does this reveal about how we choose to trust? What does this reveal about the mechanisms that allow us to be deceived by people who are exactly what we need them to be? In November 1932, approximately 10 months before her exposure, she made a decision that would set in motion the events that would eventually dismantle everything. She had been living in Houston continuously for 14 years. She had become 12 different people. She had successfully integrated herself into the highest levels of Houston society. She had money, significant money taken from various victims and hidden in accounts under names that would require significant investigation to trace. She could have left. She could have taken that money and moved to another city, another state, another country. She could have disappeared permanently and started over in a place where no one knew any of her identities, where she could continue this work indefinitely. Instead, she stayed. And worse, she committed an error that, in hindsight, seems almost deliberately self-destructive. She created 2 identities that operated in the same social circles during the same time period. The 11th identity was Eleanor, the second Eleanor, a different person entirely from the Eleanor of 1926 who had loved Margaret Hutchinson so completely. This new Eleanor was positioned as a visiting relative of one of Houston's banking families, someone passing through for the winter season. She was sophisticated and well-traveled. She was interested in art and literature. She was lonely in a way that suggested she had experienced profound loss. She met Catherine Embry, the second Catherine, another entirely different person than the Catherine who had left James Embry standing in the library with a ring he could not return, at a charity event in late 1932. Catherine and Eleanor became friends. This was not unusual. Women formed friendships at society events. What was unusual was the degree of intimacy that developed between these 2 identities. Catherine and Eleanor would meet for lunch. They would attend concerts together. They shared confidences. And crucially, they shared the same circle of acquaintances. They went to the same parties. They were seen together by the same people. And because both Catherine and Eleanor wore similar jewelry, gold bracelets with rubies because that was a detail she had liked and carried from one identity to another, People began to notice them. People began to comment on how much they looked alike. People began to joke about whether they might be sisters. Did she notice these comments? Did she understand the risk she was taking? The answer is almost certainly yes, but something in her had changed. The thrill of the deception, the pleasure of being known and loved had become insufficient. She had begun to crave something more. She wanted to be known as herself. She wanted someone to see through the deceptions, to understand the multiplicity, to appreciate the extraordinary work it took to be 12 different people. She wanted, in some deeply self-destructive way, to be caught. She wanted the exposure that would come if someone realized the truth. Or perhaps she was simply exhausted. Perhaps after 14 years of maintaining these separate identities, of never being able to be fully herself with anyone, of constantly monitoring her behavior and her stories and her presentation, her psychological resources were depleted. Perhaps she made the mistake of creating Catherine and Eleanor in overlapping circles not because she wanted to be caught, but because she no longer had the energy to maintain perfect separation. There is a moment in every successful deception when the deceiver could stop. There is a moment when they have achieved everything they set out to achieve, when they have accumulated enough resources, when they have satisfied enough of their psychological needs, when they could simply walk away. If she had walked away in November 1932, if she had disappeared from Houston at that moment, the 12 people she had deceived would have been hurt, but they would have eventually recovered. They would have found some narrative to make sense of what had happened. They would have moved on. But she did not stop. She stayed. She created overlapping identities. She increased the risk of exposure to a critical level. She did something that, in retrospect, looks almost like a suicide attempt, except that instead of killing herself, she was killing the carefully constructed identities that had become her life. In February 1933, approximately 9 months before the exposure at the Petroleum Club, a friend of Catherine's mentioned to Eleanor that Catherine had a bracelet exactly like one of Eleanor's. Eleanor expressed surprise. She said she had never seen Catherine's bracelet. But the moment the comment was made, Eleanor must have understood what was happening. She must have realized that the overlapping identities had been noticed, that people were beginning to perceive inconsistencies, that the infrastructure of the deception was becoming unstable, and instead of disappearing, instead of protecting these identities, she did nothing. She allowed the situation to develop. She allowed Catherine and Eleanor to continue to exist in the same social circles. She allowed the discrepancies to accumulate. There is something almost merciful about this. There is something almost loving about the way she allowed her own exposure. Because exposure would mean that the 12 people she had deceived would finally understand that they had not been alone in their deception. They would finally understand that this was not about them, that they had not been uniquely vulnerable, that their failure to perceive the deception was not a personal failing. They would finally understand that they had been part of something extraordinary, something that required almost superhuman psychological skill. The exposure would allow them to shift from self-blame to something more nuanced, a complex understanding that they had been deceived by someone who was herself fragmented, broken, lost. Did she understand this? Did she stay and allow the exposure because she loved these people and wanted to give them something, the gift of understanding? Or did she simply no longer have the strength to continue? The question that haunts this moment is, could she have stopped? If she had wanted to walk away in November 1932, could she have done so? Did she have the capacity to be just one person, to live just one life, to be content with just one form of existence? The answer is almost certainly no. The hunger to be known, to be multiple, to be reinvented, this hunger was fundamental to who she was. She could not have stopped any more than someone could stop breathing. The only way to end this was for the structure to collapse entirely. And so, in some deep and possibly unconscious way, she collaborated in her own exposure. The moments between Margaret's question about the bracelet and the full exposure stretched across weeks. What began in that powder room was not an immediate revelation, but a slow and methodical process of verification and discovery. Margaret, shaken by the encounter, did not immediately confront Catherine Embry. Instead, she did something more careful. She began to ask questions. She asked friends if they knew Catherine Embry. She asked if anyone else had known someone named Eleanor, someone with a face like Catherine's, someone who had also worn a bracelet with 3 rubies set at precise intervals. The answers came slowly, but they came. One woman remembered Eleanor from 1926. Another woman knew of a Sarah who had been close to her sister-in-law. and who had disappeared, leaving financial devastation in her wake. A lawyer began to mention a Miriam who had claimed an inheritance that seemed suspicious. Within 2 weeks, Margaret had gathered 5 other people who believed they had been deceived by the same woman in different identities. By late November, that number had grown to 9. The newspaper articles began in early December 1933. The Houston Chronicle ran a front-page story with the headline, "12 Faced Fraud. Houston Society, Victim to 12 Separate Identities." The paper provided an image of her, though no one could quite agree if it was accurate, since each person who had known her had known someone different. The police began an investigation. Banks began checking their records. Lawyers began reviewing documents. But by the time the investigation fully mobilized, she was gone. She had left Houston on November 23rd, purchasing a train ticket under yet another name, heading toward California with the money she had accumulated and the skills she had developed over 14 years of being multiple people. She was never apprehended. She was never brought to trial. She simply disappeared into the same kind of invisibility that had characterized her childhood, becoming no one again, after having been 12 different someones. The unraveling, however, continued for years. The 12 victims began to understand what had happened to them, but understanding and healing were not the same thing. Margaret Hutchinson did recover financially. The money she had given to Eleanor was eventually traced through banking records, and she reclaimed most of it. But she never recovered emotionally. She spent the remainder of her life convinced that she lacked the ability to judge character accurately. She withdrew from society. She became suspicious of every new person who approached her. She died in 1951 at the age of 81, having lived the last 18 years of her life in profound isolation. James Embry, who had been engaged to Catherine, never married. He attempted to trace Catherine's movements after the exposure, hoping that if he could find her, he could understand what had happened to him. He spent thousands of dollars on private investigators. He wrote letters that were never answered. In the 1940s, he was institutionalized for what would now be recognized as obsessive-compulsive disorder, though it was never officially diagnosed. He was released from the institution before his death in 1956. His friends reported that until the moment of his death, he sometimes seemed to be looking at people as if he was trying to recognize something in them, some element that would tell him he was being deceived. Patricia, the widow who had changed her will in favor of Miriam, left an estate that was contested for years. Her actual relatives eventually reclaimed what had been left to Miriam, but the process took a decade and drained much of the estate's resources. Patricia's children reported that their mother had loved Miriam more than she had loved them, and they never fully recovered from that knowledge. The question of whether Patricia's love for Miriam was genuine, whether it had been earned through legitimate emotional connection, haunted them for the rest of their lives. Eleanor's victim, Margaret Hutchinson, a different Margaret, there being only 3 or 4 original names repeated across the 12 identities, attempted suicide in 1935. She survived, but spent the remainder of her life in psychiatric care. Her husband, the judge, filed for divorce but never remarried. He became increasingly socially isolated, unable to trust anyone. He died at the age of 63, reportedly from a stress-related illness. The judge's will, when opened, contained a provision leaving a substantial amount of money to the city's psychiatric hospital, with a request that it be used to help women who had experienced psychological trauma. What does this reveal about the cost of deception? What does this reveal about the ways that lies don't just steal money or time or opportunity, but steal something far more fundamental? The ability to trust one's own perception of reality? The woman who was 12 had, in a very real sense, destroyed 12 lives, not through violence, not through theft, though she had stolen, but through a profound violation of human trust. She had shown each person that it was possible to be loved by someone, and yet be completely wrong about who that person was. She had shown each person that intimate knowledge of another person might be an illusion. She had taught them that being understood was not the same as understanding, and this knowledge, once acquired, could never be unlearned. In some ways, exposure was a mercy. The victims finally understood that they had been part of something larger than their individual failure. They finally understood that they had been targeted specifically because they had particular vulnerabilities that the deceiver had identified and exploited. They finally understood that this was not about them, it was about someone else. Someone who was broken in ways they were only beginning to understand. But understanding did not heal them. Understanding did not give them back their faith in human connection. Understanding did not repair the damage that had been done to their ability to form intimate relationships with others. What the woman who was 12 had accomplished was not just a series of crimes. What she had accomplished was a systematic assault on human faith. She had weaponized intimacy itself. She had taken the desire to be known and understood and transformed it into a mechanism of psychological destruction. By 1940, 7 years after the exposure, 5 of the 12 victims had died, some from suicide, some from stress-related illnesses, some from accidents that seemed suspiciously connected to depression or psychological deterioration. The survivors lived on, but they lived diminished. They lived with a scar that never fully healed, a wound that was always present, a knowledge that the person they had trusted most had never existed at all. The woman who was 12 was never found. Despite efforts by law enforcement in multiple states, despite newspaper articles and descriptions, despite theories about where she might have gone, she seemed to have accomplished what she had always accomplished. She had become invisible. The private investigators hired by the victims found no trace of her in California, no records of her in any other city. She had achieved the ultimate disappearance. She had become no one. Or perhaps, and this is a possibility worth considering, she had simply returned to being the person she had been before any of the 12 identities. She had gone back to the fundamentals of being invisible. She had found a place where no one knew her, where she had no history, where she could exist without the constant work of construction and maintenance. Perhaps she eventually tired of the identities entirely and learned to be content with complete anonymity. Perhaps the hunger to be known had finally burned itself out, leaving only exhaustion behind. We will never know what happened to the woman who was 12 because her story, like all of our stories, is incomplete. We only know the parts that were exposed, that were written about, that were documented in newspaper archives and legal files and the memories of her victims. The rest of her life, where she went, what she became, whether she continued this work or abandoned it, whether she ever achieved peace, that part of her story is lost to history. But what her story reveals about us, about all of us, is not lost. Her story reveals something true about human vulnerability that we would rather not acknowledge. It reveals that all of us are susceptible to deception. It reveals that the desire to be known, to be understood, to be seen as we truly are, is powerful enough to override our skepticism. It reveals that we are all capable of overlooking red flags, of rationalizing inconsistencies, of choosing belief over doubt. If the emotional reward of being understood is large enough, the question that her story poses is not, how could those 12 people be so foolish? The question is, in what ways are we all vulnerable to being manipulated by someone who offers us exactly what we most desperately need? The answer is uncomfortable. The answer is that we are all vulnerable, that every single one of us has vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood us deeply enough, who paid close enough attention to our needs, who offered us the experience of being truly known. It is not that the 12 victims were uniquely foolish. It is that the woman who was 12 was uniquely skilled at identifying what people wanted most, and providing it with such perfection that belief became impossible to resist. Consider the moment when Margaret noticed the identical bracelets. That moment was not the beginning of the exposure. That moment was the moment when something in Margaret's consciousness shifted. That moment was when Margaret had to choose between maintaining her belief in Eleanor's authenticity and acknowledging the possibility that she had been deceived. She chose to investigate rather than to dismiss. But for weeks before that moment, she must have noticed inconsistencies. She must have noticed things that did not quite align. And she chose not to pursue those inconsistencies because the alternative, admitting that she had been completely wrong about someone she loved, was too painful to contemplate. This is how deception works, not through dramatic lies that cannot possibly be believed, but through the exploitation of our need to believe in the people who make us feel known and understood. This is how a single person could become 12 different people and deceive dozens of individuals, not through manipulation or coercion, but through understanding human nature well enough to know exactly which version of themselves each person needed her to be. What does this tell us about intimacy? What does this tell us about the ways that we construct narratives about the people we love, narratives that might be more about our needs than about who those people actually are? What does this tell us about the difference between being understood and understanding? The most profound insight that the 12 victims eventually achieved, the insight that some of them never fully articulated but all of them lived with, was this: the deception itself might have revealed more truth about who she actually was than anything she could have said directly. Her multiplicity, her fragmentation, her inability to maintain a single identity, these things were not performances. These things were genuine expressions of a person who was fundamentally fragmented, who had no stable self, who could only exist through construction. This is not absolution. This is not an excuse. It is only an acknowledgement that the person who was 12 was, in her own broken way, being authentic. She was authentically multiple. She was authentically unable to maintain single relationships. She was authentically desperate to be known while being fundamentally incapable of genuine connection. Every person she deceived was deceived by someone who was genuinely that person in the moment. Catherine was genuinely Catherine. Miriam was genuinely Miriam. Eleanor was genuinely Eleanor. The crime was not that she was lying. The crime was that the person being is not the same as being a person. One of the victims, years later, would write in a private journal, "I loved her. That much was true, but I loved a person who did not exist, and she loved me too, but her love did not exist either. So we loved each other perfectly, and the love was entirely false. The tragedy is not that I was deceived. The tragedy is that for the first time in my life, I felt completely understood by another human being, and that feeling was the deception itself. This is what the 12 revealed about us all. They revealed that we are desperate to be known. They revealed that we will overlook almost anything if the emotional reward of being understood is large enough. They revealed that the desire for intimacy can become a vulnerability. They revealed that sometimes the most profound truths are delivered through lies. They revealed that we are all capable of both deception and self-deception. Have you experienced deception like this, either as the one deceived or as an observer? We're interested in the psychological patterns beneath the surfaces. What did you miss? What did you see? What surprised you? Share your story with us at Velvet Trap Sagmail. Gmider. Your perspective helps us understand how deception actually works, how it shapes us, how it reveals us. If this psychological exploration resonated with you, leave a like. Share it with someone who loves understanding human nature. Subscribe to Velvet Traps, new explorations of deception and psychology every week. Every episode is designed to help you understand not just how people lie, but why they lie, what that lying reveals about human vulnerability, and what lies reveal about the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. And remember, Velvet Traps exists to explore the psychology of deception, not to celebrate it. If you have a story about trust broken, identity hidden, manipulation endured, or the masks we wear in the presence of others, and you're willing to share it, write to Velvet Trap Sagmail.com. These stories help us understand ourselves and each other. Every submission is read. Your experience is part of this investigation into what it means to be known and what it means to be deceived. Our email is velvettrapsagmail. Anonymous submissions, welcome. Your experience matters.